History confirms a stark and unforgiving reality. Air power, for all its technological sophistication and destructive capability, has never on its own achieved the ultimate political objective of regime change. This is not a controversial opinion but a brutal lesson etched into the annals of modern warfare, from the firebombed cities of the Second World War to the dusty landscapes of the Middle East. Every successful and lasting political transition forced by an external power has, without exception, been consummated by the physical presence of ground troops, the final, unavoidable arbiters of control. Today, the United States stands on the precipice of a monumental strategic miscalculation regarding the Islamic Republic of Iran, an error in judgment so profound it threatens to unravel the very fabric of global economic and political stability. While Washington remains fixated on a doctrine of high-tech, capital-intensive warfare, spending an almost surreal sum of up to $33 million to intercept a single missile that may have cost as little as $100,000 to produce, Iran has spent 2 decades meticulously preparing for an entirely different kind of conflict. Theirs is not a strategy designed to meet the United States on its own terms, but to subvert them. It is a fundamentally economic and asymmetric strategy crafted for the specific vulnerabilities of a 21st century globalized world. By targeting the critical yet fragile infrastructure of the Gulf Cooperation Council nations, specifically their desalination plants and oil facilities, Iran's strategic objective transcends the battlefield. It aims squarely at the heart of American power, the petrodollar system. This system, which has anchored the American economy and its global hegemony for half a century, is the foundation upon which its current technological and financial dominance, including the much-vaunted AI investment boom, is built. We, in the West, are currently enthralled and blinded by what can only be described as the precision strike illusion, the seductive and deeply flawed belief that surgical aerial attacks, drone warfare, and standoff munitions can substitute for the messy, bloody, and politically costly business of physical occupation and control. This illusion fosters a dangerous hubris, leading policymakers to believe that conflict can be managed remotely with minimal risk and predictable outcomes. Yet this looming conflict is not driven solely by cold, calculated strategy. It is fueled by a volatile cocktail of personal political incentives and esoteric, often unspoken, agendas. The motivations for war are rarely as pure as they are presented for public consumption. They are shaped by the immense power of foreign financial influence peddled in the corridors of power, which seeks to leverage American military might for regional objectives. They are also molded by the eschatological scripts of influential and often clandestine groups and secret societies, whose worldviews may see a cataclysmic conflict as a necessary or even desirable step towards a prophesied end. In this tangled web, the motivations for war too often serve the ambitions and ideologies of leaders, rather than the security and prosperity of the nation they lead. Ultimately, should this illusion of a clean, technological victory shatter, the logical next step according to conventional military doctrine would be a ground invasion. Such an action would not be a mistake. It would be a self-inflicted catastrophe of historic proportions. It would mean pitting the might of the U.S. military against a nation of 85 million people, a population bound by a fierce and ancient sense of national identity, fighting on their own soil. This is a land of vast deserts and, more importantly, formidable, defensible mountainous terrain that has humbled empires for millennia. In this high-stakes struggle for the future of the Middle East and the global order, the West is dangerously applying outdated 20th-century logic, centered on conventional military dominance, to a meticulously constructed 21st-century trap. The belief that air power alone can secure decisive political victory is one of the most persistent and dangerous myths of modern military thought. It is a testament to the allure of technology, promising a form of warfare that is clean, swift, and most importantly, low in friendly casualties. Yet, a dispassionate examination of military history reveals a consistent pattern of failure when this theory is put to the test. The Second World War provides the foundational case study. The Allied strategic bombing campaigns against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were unprecedented in their scale and ferocity. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Tokyo were systematically razed, industrial capacity was crippled, and civilian morale was targeted with terrifying precision. The theory, articulated by strategists like Giulio Douhet and Billy Mitchell, was that by destroying an enemy's industrial heartland and breaking the will of its populace, the political leadership would be forced to capitulate. The reality was starkly different. In Germany, despite the near-total destruction of its urban centers, war production paradoxically increased in some sectors until late 1944. The regime, far from collapsing, used the bombing to fuel its propaganda, stiffening resolve and tightening its totalitarian grip. The ultimate defeat of the Third Reich came only after the boots of Allied and Soviet soldiers stood on the rubble of Berlin. Japan's case, while often cited as a victory for air power due to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is more complex. The atomic bombs were a shocking and decisive display of a new form of power, but they were deployed against a nation that was already strategically defeated, with its navy sunk, its air force shattered, and its armies isolated across Asia. The bombings served as a catalyst for a surrender that was already being debated within the Japanese high command, spurred on by the imminent threat of a massive ground invasion and the Soviet Union's entry into the war. The bomb provided a face-saving exit, but it did not in isolation defeat the Japanese Empire. This lesson was relearned in the jungles of Southeast Asia. During the Vietnam War, the United States unleashed Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that lasted for over 3 years. The tonnage of bombs dropped exceeded that of the entire Second World War. The objective was to coerce Hanoi into ending its support for the Viet Cong insurgency in the South. Yet, despite the immense destruction, the flow of supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail continued, and the political will of the North Vietnamese leadership never broke. The conflict demonstrated that a determined, ideologically motivated adversary with a high pain threshold could absorb astonishing levels of punishment delivered from the air, rendering the technological superiority of its opponent strategically impotent. The war was ultimately lost not in the skies over Hanoi, but in the political and psychological landscape of both Vietnam and the United States. Even conflicts often hailed as triumphs of air power reveal its inherent limitations upon closer inspection. The 1991 Gulf War is a prime example. The air campaign was undeniably brilliant and devastatingly effective, crippling the Iraqi military's command and control and decimating its armored columns. However, the political objective was not regime change in Baghdad, but the liberation of Kuwait. Air power achieved the conditions for victory, but the final expulsion of Iraqi forces was accomplished by a 100-hour ground offensive. A decade later, the initial phases of the war in Afghanistan in 2001 saw U.S. air power, combined with local Northern Alliance fighters on the ground, swiftly topple the Taliban regime. This, however, highlights the rule rather than the exception. Air power was a powerful enabler, but it required a ground force, in this case, a proxy one, to seize and hold territory and to ultimately displace the existing political authority. The subsequent two-decade insurgency, which ultimately saw the Taliban return to power, further underscores the inability of air superiority to impose a lasting political settlement in the absence of a viable and sustainable ground-level strategy. The 2011 NATO intervention in Libya offers a final, cautionary tale. Air power was decisive in preventing Muammar Gaddafi's forces from crushing the rebellion in Benghazi and leveling the playing field for outgunned rebel forces. But it was those rebel forces, fighting street by street, who ultimately captured Tripoli and brought the regime down. NATO's air power created a permissive environment, but it did not and could not provide the solution. It shattered the existing state structure but was incapable of building a new one, leaving behind a power vacuum that has since been filled by chaos, civil war, and instability. The historical record is clear. Air power is a formidable instrument of destruction, a critical tool for shaping the battlefield and enabling ground operations, but it is not a political panacea. The fantasy that a war for regime change can be won from 30,000 feet with no risk and no mess is just that, a fantasy. To believe otherwise in the context of Iran is to ignore the most painful and consistent lessons of the past century of warfare. The strategic chessboard of the 21st century is defined not by the clash of symmetrical armies, but by the cunning exploitation of vulnerabilities. While the United States has perfected a model of warfare based on overwhelming technological and financial might, Iran has cultivated a doctrine of asymmetric warfare designed to turn America's greatest strengths into debilitating weaknesses. This divergence in strategic thinking has created a perilous gap in perception, where Washington sees a manageable regional adversary, while Tehran sees an opportunity to trigger a systemic global crisis. The American miscalculation is rooted in the precision strike illusion, a deep-seated institutional belief in the efficacy of technology. The U.S. military-industrial complex produces weapon systems of breathtaking sophistication, stealth bombers, fifth-generation fighters, and multi-layered missile defense networks like Aegis, THAAD, and Patriot. These systems are designed to achieve total dominance and ensure that any conflict is fought at a distance, with American personnel shielded from harm. However, this technological supremacy comes at a staggering economic cost. The expenditure of a multi-million-dollar interceptor missile to destroy a drone or rocket built for a fraction of the price represents a fundamentally unsustainable economic equation. It is a strategy of attrition that overwhelmingly favors the producer of the cheaper weapon. Iran, by investing in vast arsenals of drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, can threaten to overwhelm these complex defensive systems through sheer volume. Each successful strike, regardless of the target, is a strategic victory for Iran, not because it destroys a specific military asset, but because it forces the U.S. and its allies into an economically ruinous defensive posture. This illusion of clean, technological warfare also has a dangerous psychological component. It fosters a belief among policymakers and the public that war can be a sterile, video game-like affair, divorced from the brutal realities of human cost and unintended consequences. It encourages risk-taking by creating a false sense of control and predictability, blinding decision-makers to the complex, non-linear nature of conflict. In stark contrast, Iran's strategy is a masterclass in 21st century asymmetric warfare. Recognizing its inability to compete with the U.S. in a conventional conflict, Iran has focused its efforts on identifying and targeting the critical choke points of the global system. Its doctrine is not primarily military but economic. The designated targets are not aircraft carriers or army bases, but the seemingly mundane yet existentially vital infrastructure of its regional rivals in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Their oil processing facilities and their desalination plants. The targeting of oil infrastructure, as seen in the 2019 attacks on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq and Qurai's facilities, is a direct assault on the global economy. A successful, sustained campaign against Gulf oil production would send shockwaves through global energy markets, causing prices to skyrocket and potentially triggering a worldwide recession. But the goal is even more specific and insidious: to attack the petrodollar system. Since the 1970s, the global oil trade has been denominated in U.S. dollars, creating a constant, artificial demand for American currency. This has granted the United States what former French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege, allowing it to run massive trade deficits and fund its government through borrowing at low interest rates. The petrodollar is the bedrock of America's economic empire. By demonstrating that the U.S. cannot protect the flow of oil from its key allies, Iran aims to shatter the confidence in this system. If oil-producing nations begin to doubt American security guarantees, they may start to price their oil in other currencies, eroding the dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency. The consequences of such a shift would be catastrophic for the U.S. economy. It would lead to rampant inflation, a sovereign debt crisis, and the collapse of the financial architecture that supports its global power. The current AI investment boom, a phenomenon fueled by vast amounts of capital chasing high-risk, high-reward ventures, would evaporate overnight in the face of such a fundamental economic shock. Even more diabolical is the targeting of desalination plants. For arid Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait, fresh water is more precious than oil. Their massive, technologically advanced desalination facilities are the lifeblood of their societies, providing the water necessary for drinking, sanitation, and agriculture. These plants are sprawling, vulnerable, soft targets. A coordinated attack could plunge these nations into an immediate and irreversible humanitarian crisis. It would make their gleaming megacities uninhabitable, generate social chaos, and potentially lead to the collapse of their governments. This is not warfare aimed at defeating an army, it is warfare aimed at collapsing a society. Iran has spent the last 2 decades patiently building the capabilities to execute this strategy. It has cultivated a powerful network of regional proxies, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militias in Iraq and Syria. This axis of resistance allows Iran to project power, harass its adversaries, and wage war with a degree of plausible deniability, all while keeping the conflict at arm's length from its own borders. Concurrently, it has invested heavily in a domestic arms industry focused on producing precisely the weapons needed for this strategy. Long-range drones, precision-guided missiles, and fast attack craft designed to swarm enemy warships in the narrow waters of the Persian Gulf. This is the 21st century trap Iran has laid. It is a hybrid strategy that blends proxy warfare, economic coercion, and asymmetric military technology, all designed to circumvent America's conventional strengths and attack its systemic vulnerabilities. It is a trap that the West, blinded by its own technological hubris, seems poised to walk directly into. The path to war is seldom paved with rational strategic calculus alone. Beneath the surface of geopolitical posturing and military planning lies a murky underworld of hidden agendas, personal ambitions, and powerful ideologies that can hijack the machinery of the state and steer it toward conflict for reasons that have little to do with the national interest. The potential for a war with Iran is a case study in how these unseen hands can shape destiny, often with devastating consequences. A primary driver is the realm of personal and domestic political incentives. For any leader facing sagging approval ratings, domestic strife, or a challenging election, the temptation of a foreign policy crisis can be immense. The rally round the flag effect, a well-documented phenomenon where the public temporarily boosts its support for a leader during times of international conflict, offers a powerful, if cynical, tool for political survival. A short, seemingly successful military engagement can distract from problems at home, create a narrative of strong leadership, and silence political opposition. In such a scenario, the long-term strategic wisdom of a conflict with Iran becomes secondary to the short-term political gains it might offer. This is compounded by the immense and pervasive influence of the military-industrial complex. A state of perpetual tension, punctuated by periodic conflict, is the lifeblood of the defense industry. The specter of a powerful adversary like Iran justifies colossal defense budgets, fuels the development and sale of new weapon systems, and enriches a network of contractors, lobbyists, and their political allies. The economic incentives for war are deeply embedded in the political system, creating a powerful constituency that benefits from conflict, regardless of its cost in blood and treasure. Furthermore, American foreign policy is not formulated in a vacuum. It is subject to intense pressure from foreign financial and political influence. Nations in the Middle East who view Iran as an existential threat have spent decades and billions of dollars cultivating influence in Washington. This is achieved through sophisticated lobbying efforts, funding for think tanks that produce policy papers advocating for hawkish positions, campaign contributions to pliable politicians, and the cultivation of favorable media narratives. This relentless campaign creates an echo chamber in the halls of power, where the arguments for confronting Iran are amplified and the arguments for restraint are marginalized. The result is a foreign policy that can, at times, appear to be serving the strategic interests of regional allies more than those of the United States itself, committing American resources and lives to conflicts that are not central to its own security. Perhaps the most disquieting and least discussed factor is the role of esoteric agendas and ideologies. History is replete with examples of leaders and influential groups whose actions were guided by worldviews that lie outside the realm of conventional political analysis. The idea of eschatological scripts refers to belief systems, often religious or quasi-religious in nature, that view history as progressing toward a predetermined, often apocalyptic, conclusion. For adherents of such beliefs, which can be found in various forms, from certain strains of Christian Zionism to other millenarian ideologies, A climactic confrontation with a perceived evil entity like Iran may not be an event to be avoided, but one to be welcomed as a fulfillment of prophecy. When such individuals or groups achieve positions of influence within a government, their ideological commitments can subtly or overtly shape policy, imbuing it with a sense of divine mandate that is immune to rational debate or cost-benefit analysis. These secret societies need not be conspiratorial cabals meeting in darkened rooms. They can be informal networks of elites bound by a shared, unorthodox worldview who work to steer the ship of state toward their desired destination. When these hidden motivations, the political, the financial, and the ideological, converge, they create a powerful current pulling the nation toward war. They obscure the true costs of conflict and replace sober strategic thought with ambition, greed, and dogma. The public is presented with a sanitized rationale for war, centered on national security and human rights, while the true, often less noble, drivers remain shrouded in secrecy. Should the illusions of a clean, remote-controlled war be shattered and the hidden agendas prevail, the horrifyingly logical endpoint of the current trajectory is a ground invasion of Iran. To contemplate such an undertaking is to contemplate a strategic blunder so profound it would eclipse the follies of Vietnam and Iraq combined. It would be a willing descent into a quagmire of unimaginable scale and complexity, a catastrophic error that would bleed the United States of its wealth, its power, and its spirit for a generation. The first and most fundamental obstacle is the sheer human and geographical scale of Iran. This is not a fractured, relatively small nation like Iraq in 2003. Iran is a country of 85 million people, heirs to one of the world's oldest and proudest civilizations. While there is significant internal discontent with the ruling clerical regime, a foreign invasion would almost certainly trigger a powerful nationalist response. Many Iranians who despise their own government would despise a foreign occupier even more. The U.S. would not be seen as a liberator but as the latest in a long line of imperial powers seeking to subjugate Persia. It would face not just the regime's security forces but a protracted insurgency fought by a vast, motivated, and armed populace. The geography of Iran is a military strategist's nightmare and an insurgent's dream. It is a vast country, 4 times the size of Iraq, dominated by formidable mountain ranges like the Zagros and the Elbers. These rugged, inhospitable landscapes are perfect for guerrilla warfare, providing endless cover and concealment for fighters while crippling the effectiveness of a conventional mechanized army. The logistical challenges of supplying an occupying force across such terrain would be immense, with every convoy vulnerable to ambush. The American experience in the mountains of Afghanistan, a country with less than half of Iran's population, should serve as a chilling warning. In Iran, these challenges would be magnified tenfold. The Iranian military, while technologically inferior to the U.S., is structured specifically to counter an invasion. It consists of 2 parallel forces. The regular army, Artesh, responsible for defending the borders, and the ideologically fervent Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, tasked with preserving the regime and managing Iran's asymmetric and proxy warfare capabilities. The IRGC, in particular, has spent decades planning for exactly this scenario. It would melt into the population and the mountains, directing a nationwide insurgency using tactics honed by its proxies across the Middle East. The occupying forces would face a relentless onslaught of improvised explosive devices, sophisticated ambushes, sniper attacks, and suicide bombings on a scale that would make the insurgency in Iraq seem like a low-intensity conflict. What would victory in such a scenario even look like? The toppling of the regime in Tehran would be merely the beginning of the nightmare. The U.S. and its allies would be saddled with the responsibility of governing a vast, hostile, and deeply fractured nation. The occupation would require hundreds of thousands of troops for decades at a cost of trillions of dollars. The casualties would be staggering. The ensuing power vacuum would likely unleash sectarian and ethnic conflicts that have been simmering for generations, potentially leading to the violent breakup of the country. This would create a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, with millions of refugees flooding into neighboring countries and toward Europe, destabilizing the entire region. Far from eliminating a threat, a ground invasion would almost certainly create a new, more virulent one. likely a failed state that becomes a breeding ground for extremist groups even more radical than the current regime. It would be an act of strategic suicide, a catastrophic error born of hubris and a profound misunderstanding of the country, its people, and the very nature of modern warfare. In the grand, unfolding drama of global power, the gravest errors are often born from a failure of imagination. They arise when established powers, comfortable in their dominance, apply the logic of a bygone era to the challenges of a new one. The United States and its Western allies, in their current posture toward Iran, are falling into precisely this trap. They are wielding the formidable, yet antiquated, tools of 20th century conventional warfare against an adversary that has mastered the insidious, systemic arts of a 21st century conflict. The entire Western strategic framework is built upon a foundation of technological superiority, a belief that conflicts can be won through superior firepower, precision targeting, and information dominance. This has given rise to the precision strike illusion, a dangerous fantasy that war can be managed from a distance, like a complex engineering problem, free from the unpredictable and messy human element. This illusion is seductive because it promises victory without sacrifice, control without commitment. Yet it is a siren song luring the ship of state toward the rocks of a catastrophic miscalculation. Iran, through decades of careful planning and observation, has engineered a strategy that bypasses this strength entirely. It is a doctrine of asymmetric economic and societal warfare, designed not to defeat the U.S. military, but to collapse the global system upon which American power rests. By targeting the economic jugular of the world, the oil and financial infrastructure of the Persian Gulf, Iran threatens to unleash chaos on a scale not seen in generations. This is not a strategy of conquest, but of sabotage. A plan to burn down the entire system in order to cripple its most powerful player. The motivations driving the West toward this confrontation are as misguided as its strategy. The halls of power echo not with sober, long-term strategic analysis, but with the siren calls of short-term political expediency, the vast profits of the defense industry, the agendas of foreign allies, and the chilling, fanatical whispers of eschatological ideologies. A war conceived in such a corrupted environment cannot lead to a positive outcome. It is a policy disconnected from the national interest, a path chosen not for its wisdom but for the powerful vested interests that demand it. The final, terrible destination on this path is a ground invasion of Iran, a folly of such epic proportions that it would redefine the meaning of strategic overreach. It would be a war against a people and a terrain that have humbled empires, a conflict that could not be won but could be endlessly lost, draining America of its treasure, its blood, and its global standing. The West is standing at a crossroads. It can continue to cling to its outdated logic, viewing Iran through the simplistic lens of military targets and regime vulnerability, and in doing so, stumble into the meticulously prepared trap that awaits. Or, it can awaken from its technological trance, recognize the true nature of the 21st century threat it faces, and understand that the greatest challenges of our time cannot be solved by the bomb and the bayonet. To fail to do so will be to commit an unforced error of historic magnitude, proving that the greatest threat to a powerful nation is often its own hubris.